I'm a 45-year-old father of 3, and this story is about my difficult relationship with my oldest daughter, Kelly. She's 26 now, but the problems between us started 10 years ago after I divorced her mother. I'm not looking for sympathy here, just trying to put the pieces together of what went so wrong. The divorce was ugly. Kelly was 16 and it hit her hard. I had caught her mother cheating, which was a huge blow to me. But what hurt even more was that Kelly didn't seem to care. She didn't believe me. To her, the divorce was my fault, not her mother's. I tried to explain to her how I had no choice, how I'd caught her mom in the act, but Kelly didn't want to hear it. She was angry at me for breaking up the family. What made things even worse was the custody battle. I fought hard to keep Kelly close, but when it came down to it, she chose to live with her mom. That decision stung. I felt abandoned. She and I had always been close, or at least I thought so. But after that, it was like she wanted nothing to do with me. I remarried a couple of years later, and Kelly saw it as me moving on too quickly. She didn't like my new wife, didn't want to meet her. And when we had 2 more kids together, it seemed to drive the wedge between us even deeper. Kelly and I spoke only when necessary. Birthdays, holidays, the occasional text. But it was clear she didn't want much to do with me or my new family. I kept telling myself it would get better with time. Maybe she just needed space to work through her feelings. Maybe she'd come around when she was older. That never happened. I found out Kelly was engaged through a mutual friend. She didn't even tell me herself. When I first heard the news, I was happy for her. I figured maybe this would be a chance for us to reconnect. I reached out with a congratulatory text and told her I'd love to be a part of the wedding planning, help out in any way I could, even walk her down the aisle if she'd let me. She didn't respond right away, and when she finally did, it was cold. She said she wasn't sure yet about the guest list and was still deciding who she wanted there. That's when I realized I might not be invited at all. Weeks went by, and I heard nothing more from her. I tried to stay hopeful, but it was hard when every piece of information I got about the wedding was secondhand. Family members were telling me about the venue, the colors, the guest list, all planned with her mother and stepfather, while I was completely left out. Then I found out the wedding date through one of my relatives. Still no invite. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out to Kelly again, asking her flat out why I hadn't been invited. I didn't want to guilt trip her or make her feel bad, but I needed to know. That's when she hit me with the truth, and it broke me. She told me she hadn't invited me because, in her eyes, I had abandoned her all those years ago. She didn't see my efforts to stay in her life, only that I had remarried, started a new family, and left her behind. Couldn't believe it. After everything I'd done to fight for her, she thought I was the one who abandoned her. I tried to explain it to her again, how I had fought for custody, how I wanted her to be a part of my new family, but it was like talking to a wall. Kelly didn't want to hear it. In her mind, the damage had been done, and there was no fixing it. I spent a lot of time thinking about the divorce after that conversation. Was there something I could have done differently? Should I have fought harder to stay in her life even after she chose her mother? It didn't help that my other 2 kids were devastated when they found out their half-sister was getting married and didn't want our family there. They're younger, 12 and 9, and they looked up to Kelly. They couldn't understand why she would shut us out like this. I didn't have an answer for them. I started questioning myself more and more. Was I the bad guy here? Had I really failed Kelly that badly? It didn't seem fair, but maybe from her perspective I hadn't done enough. The worst part was that I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being judged. Not just by Kelly, but by everyone around me. My family knew what was happening, and the whispers were starting. I didn't know what to do. Should I just let it go and respect Kelly's decision to keep me out of her life? Or should I take a stand and show up at the wedding whether she wanted me there or not? I was at a complete loss. That's when things really started to spiral, but I'll save that for the next part. Date 1. After days of debating with myself, I made the decision. I wasn't invited to Kelly's wedding, but I felt like I had to be there. It was my daughter's big day, and no matter what had happened between us, I couldn't just sit at home pretending it wasn't happening. My wife, bless her, told me it was probably a bad idea, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see Kelly, even if just from a distance. The morning of the wedding came, and we got dressed. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I told my wife we'd stay in the back, out of sight. We drove to the venue, and the whole ride there I kept replaying how it might go down. Maybe I'd see Kelly, and it would bring back some of the good memories we had when she was younger. Maybe seeing me there would remind her that I still cared, that I'd always be there for her, no matter how much distance there was between us. When we arrived, the place was packed. Cars everywhere, people walking toward the entrance, all dressed up. My wife and I stayed in the car for a bit, watching from afar. I thought about turning back. Maybe this was a mistake, but I had come this far. I wasn't going to leave without at least seeing her in her dress. We got out of the car and stood a good distance from the entrance, just trying to catch a glimpse of Kelly. After a while, I spotted her. She was stunning. She looked just like her mother did when we got married. Except now, All I felt was a strange mix of pride and heartbreak. Seeing her like that, so grown up on the happiest day of her life, I felt like a stranger looking in from the outside. As we stood there, trying to stay unnoticed, an old family friend walked up to me. It was one of those awkward moments where they were excited to see me but quickly realized something was off. They asked why I wasn't inside with the rest of the family. I had to explain, with a forced smile, that I wasn't invited. Their face changed immediately, full of pity and confusion. It was embarrassing, to say the least. It didn't take long for Kelly's father to spot us. He came over, and before I could even say anything, he started. He demanded I leave before Kelly saw me. He said I was only going to make things worse by being there. His wife, Kelly's stepmother, wasn't far behind, backing him up, saying this was Kelly's day, not mine, and that I had no right to show up uninvited. I stood my ground. I wasn't trying to ruin anything. I told him I just wanted to see my daughter, but he wasn't having it. He threatened to call security if I didn't leave, and before I could say much else, security was already walking over. That's when it got messy. Security asked me to leave and I refused. I wasn't causing a scene, I was just standing there, but refusing to leave only made things worse. A few guests started noticing, and it didn't take long before more eyes were on us. People were whispering, trying to figure out what was happening. Some of them were relatives, people who knew the story between Kelly and me. I could feel their judgment, their stares burning into me. Then it happened. Kelly noticed me. She saw me standing there with security trying to move me out. Our eyes locked for a second, but instead of the moment of warmth or recognition I was hoping for, she turned away. No acknowledgement, no smile, nothing, just cold. I felt like I had been stabbed in the chest, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching as she walked inside as if I didn't exist. Security escorted me and my wife out. I left quietly, humiliated. There was no point in fighting anymore. I got in the car and we drove off. My wife didn't say much, but I could tell she was just as upset. The silence in the car was suffocating. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything, but all I could do was sit there in disbelief. Later that evening, my phone blew up with messages. Some family members were furious with me, accusing me of trying to ruin Kelly's wedding. They called me selfish for showing up uninvited, saying I made it all about myself. Others were more sympathetic, telling me they understood why I went and that they were sorry things went down the way they did. I spent the rest of the night second-guessing myself. Had I made a mistake? Should I have just stayed away? It wasn't like I could change anything now, but the thoughts wouldn't leave my head. I kept thinking about how far I'd been pushed out of Kelly's life, how deeply shut out I'd been, and I couldn't figure out where I went wrong. In my frustration, I turned to Reddit. I didn't know where else to go. I just needed to get it off my chest. I shared the story. How I wasn't invited. How I just wanted to see my daughter. How it all went so horribly wrong. I wasn't expecting much, just a bit of validation, maybe someone to tell me I wasn't completely in the wrong. The post blew up. Some people were on my side, saying they would have done the same thing. Others told me to respect Kelly's boundaries, that I should have known better. It was a mixed bag, but the comments didn't stop. Then, hours later, I got a private message. It was from Kelly. It was short, cold, and to the point. I asked you to stay out of my life, and now you've ruined my wedding day. That message broke me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I had lost my daughter, and there was no going back now. After Kelly's message, I was shattered. It wasn't long or filled with anger. Just that one devastating sentence. I asked you to stay out of my life, and now you've ruined my wedding day. That was it. All the years of tension, the distance between us, and my failed attempt to be there for her had finally come to a head. And now it felt like there was no turning back. I had lost her for good. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying the scene at the wedding. Kelly's message and every moment that had led us to this point. It was like drowning in regret. The next morning, I turned to Reddit again. I didn't know where else to go. I updated the post, letting everyone know what had happened, how Kelly had sent that one devastating message. I wasn't expecting much, just needed to get it out. To my surprise, the post blew up again. But this time, the comments were overwhelmingly supportive. Strangers from all over the world shared their own stories of estrangement, offering advice and words of encouragement. Some told me not to give up, that relationships like this take time and patience. Others said they'd been through similar things with their own kids or parents and that there was still hope, even when it felt impossible. Reading those comments made me feel a little less alone. But the pain of knowing I'd hurt my daughter on her wedding day was still unbearable. Then something unexpected happened. My in-laws reached out. They had heard about the wedding disaster through the grapevine and called me to offer their support. I was shocked. I didn't expect them to understand, but they told me not to give up on Kelly. They said it was clear I still cared and that maybe, with time, Kelly would come around. My wife echoed the same thoughts, suggesting I give Kelly space but not let go completely. It helped hearing that, but I was still lost, unsure of what to do next. I spent the next few days drafting messages to Kelly. Some apologetic, others more firm. I went through so many versions, trying to figure out what to say. But every time I was about to send one, I'd stop myself. Nothing I wrote seemed right, and I was afraid anything I said would only push her further away. That's when my wife suggested therapy. She thought it might help me process everything and figure out how to move forward without letting the guilt and regret eat me alive. I didn't love the idea at first, but I agreed. I knew I couldn't keep spiraling like this, and maybe talking to someone would help. I started therapy a week later, and to my surprise, it helped almost immediately. The therapist asked me questions that made me really think about my relationship with Kelly, not just the present, but everything that had led up to it. For the first time, I realized how much guilt and resentment I'd been carrying from the divorce. I had spent years blaming myself, thinking that if I'd handled things differently, maybe Kelly wouldn't have turned her back on me. It was clear that the divorce had colored every interaction we'd had since then, and I hadn't fully faced that until now. After a few sessions, I felt ready to reach out to Kelly again, not to fix everything, but to acknowledge my mistakes. I wasn't expecting her to forgive me or even reply, but I wanted to at least try. I sent her a message saying I understood why she was hurt, that I had made mistakes during the divorce, and that I would like to meet, even if it was just for closure. Weeks went by with no response. I started to lose hope again, thinking maybe Kelly really was done with me for good. But then, out of nowhere, I got an invitation. It wasn't from Kelly directly, it was from her stepmother. She was hosting a small family gathering at their house, a kind of post-wedding get-together. The invite was polite but vague, and it caught me completely off guard. I didn't know what to make of it. Was this an olive branch? Or was it just another situation where I'd feel out of place? I wasn't sure if I should go. My wife encouraged me to, reminding me that if there was even a small chance to reconnect with Kelly, it was worth it. So, despite my doubts, I decided to attend. When I arrived at Kelly's father's house, it was awkward right from the start. I was greeted by her father's side of the family, but their cold stares made it clear I wasn't exactly welcome. Kelly was there too, but she didn't come over to greet me. She kept her distance, barely acknowledging I was there. It felt like I was walking on a tightrope, unsure whether this was an opportunity for reconciliation or just another reminder of how far apart we had grown. I decided to keep a low profile, sticking to the edges of conversations and avoiding drawing too much attention to myself. But eventually, I found myself alone with Kelly. It wasn't planned, we just ended up in the same room while everyone else was outside. The silence between us was thick and heavy. Neither of us seemed to know what to say. I could see her glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, and I felt the same mix of dread and hope that I had carried into the wedding months before. Finally, Kelly broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "You shouldn't have come to the wedding," she said. "But I know why you did." Her words caught me off guard. I was expecting anger or frustration, but there was a vulnerability in her tone that I hadn't heard in years. "I'm sorry," I replied. "I just wanted to be there for you, even if I wasn't invited. I thought maybe you'd see that I still care." Kelly nodded, but she didn't say anything right away. She seemed to be processing my words, and I didn't want to rush her. After a long pause, she finally spoke again. "It's not just about the wedding. It's everything. The divorce, the remarriage, the new family. I felt like you replaced us." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always feared she felt that way, but hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Kelly, I never replaced you," I said. "I know it probably felt like that, and I'm so sorry for anything I did that made you feel left out. But you were never replaced. I've always wanted you to be part of my life." Kelly looked down, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her shirt. "I know. I guess I just didn't know how to handle everything back then. And Dad and stepmother, they didn't make it easier. They kept saying things that made me doubt you." Hearing that was a revelation. For years, I had blamed myself for the distance between us, but now I was starting to see how much influence her father and stepmother had over her perspective. "Kelly, I made mistakes," I admitted. "I wasn't perfect during the divorce, and I should have fought harder to make sure you knew how much you meant to me. But I never stopped loving you, not for a second." She nodded again, and this time, I could see tears welling up in her eyes. "I've been angry for so long, but I don't want to feel like this anymore. It's exhausting." For the first time in years, it felt like we were on the same page. We didn't resolve everything in that conversation, but it felt like a turning point. The walls between us weren't completely gone, but they were starting to crumble. Before we left the gathering, Kelly gave me a hug. It wasn't long or particularly emotional, but it was genuine. And for the first time, I felt like I had my daughter back, even if just a little. Update. Over the next few weeks, Kelly and I stayed in touch more consistently. We didn't dive into heavy topics right away. Instead, we focused on rebuilding a foundation. She started calling me occasionally, and I made a point of asking about her life without being overbearing. One day, She surprised me by asking to meet my younger kids. It was a big step, and I could tell she was nervous about it, but it went better than I could have hoped. My kids adored her, and I could see that it meant a lot to Kelly to finally feel included in this part of my life. Therapy continued to be a big part of our journey. Together, we unpacked the years of misunderstandings, resentment, and pain. There were still tough moments, but we faced them together instead of retreating into our own corners. Kelly and I are far from perfect, and we still have a long way to go. But for the first time in a decade, I feel like we're moving in the right direction. Sometimes, the road to reconciliation is messy and painful, but it's worth it when you're fighting for the people you love.